Brian says he disagrees with my viral video where the Apostle Paul taught tithing. And he says, instead, I believe that we ought to give cheerfully and not under compulsion. Hello, of course we're supposed to give cheerfully. But what many people like Brian do, who read the passage in 1 Corinthians 9, you know what they like to do? They like to get off of 1 Corinthians 9 and quote 2 Corinthians 9. Listen to me, there's two passages. One is 2 Corinthians, what Brian is quoting. That is a free will offering that Paul is collecting for the poor. And under the Old Testament, giving to the poor was always a free will offering. But 1 Corinthians, not 2nd, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is showing that God has commanded the practice of tithing in the same way he had commanded it under the Old Testament for the Levites, but now he wants the tithing given to those preaching the gospel. And so Brian and so many of you, over 1,000 comments. But what I noticed, the people who are arguing against tithing, you know what they keep doing? They want to get off of 1 Corinthians 9. They don't want to talk about 1 Corinthians 9. They want to throw out a bunch of other verses. Stop, time out. We're talking about one passage of Scripture. If you're going to argue with me or say you disagree, at least stay with the passage we're discussing. And that is 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where the Apostle Paul affirmed the need for the believers to tithe to those preaching the gospel. So what we're going to do is look at this passage again, and it's going to make sense to you. Listen to what Paul says. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 13. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered at the altar? There the Apostle Paul is referring to the Levite priests who received the tithe. He says they received support for their work of ministry. This is what they did full time. They didn't do anything else. They served as ministers, and we gave them the tithe for it. But watch what he says in the next verse, verse 14. 4 words. In the same way. Did you see that phrase? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. Notice what Paul is saying. He's saying just as the Levites received the support of Israel and Israel tied to them so they can have full-time service to them as ministers, the Lord has commanded. Now notice the phrase Paul uses. He has commanded. He didn't say he suggested. He thinks it's a good idea. But by using the word command, he is showing that this command to tithe to those preaching is as powerful as the command to tithe to the Levites. So he uses the word command to show this is a command from Scripture, not a suggestion. So I want you to see clearly what Paul is doing here. On the one side, okay, are the Levite priests who received the tithe of the people. Can you see that? On the one side are the Levite priests who received the tithe. And on the other side are the gospel preachers. And there's a bridge, something in the middle to connect the Levites to the preachers. And what is that bridge? 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 14. 4 words. In the same way. Do you see this? Levites received the tithe, and the bridge is from Levites to the preachers in the same way. Do you see that? Just as the Levites got the tithe, in the same way, we're supposed to tithe to those preaching the gospel so they can serve full time in preaching the gospel. It's so simple. Now, some people have written to me and said, well, it doesn't say the word tithe. You don't have to say the word tithe because Levites receive the tithe. We already know that already. Do you understand that? And another person wrote to me and said, we're all priests, so should we all receive tithe? I'm thinking, do you see what you do? You divert attention from 1 Corinthians 9 and you throw out other things. Of course we're all priests, but we're not all serving full-time in gospel ministry. And it is those who are serving full-time in gospel ministry that we should be tithing to. Friend, if you're going to debate with me and you're going to argue with me, please stay with 1 Corinthians 9 and explain those 4 words as the bridge. In the same way, because it's unmistakable. Paul expected the Christians to be tithing to the preachers of the gospel in the same way that Israel was tithing to the Levites. It's unmistakable. You can't argue with it, but I'll I'll listen to you. See if you have any explanation other than one that I'm giving to you right now. Tithing is New Testament, and we should be tithing to support the preachers of the gospel.